Desmond Vale was one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. And one evening he stood up in front of 400 of the richest, most dangerous people in the entire region, and swore that he'd only ever marry the woman his little girl chose. A vow he had kept for 2 whole years. The vow was supposed to be impossible, and that was the entire point of saying it. His 5-year-old daughter, Abilene, hadn't spoken a single full sentence to anyone since the day her mother passed away. Every doctor, every specialist money could buy had given up. She wasn't going to choose anybody. She couldn't. The vow was a locked door, and everyone in his world understood it was a locked door, and that was exactly why he'd made it. Then that silent little girl climbed down off the platform all on her own, and she walked right past a ballroom full of women in glittering gowns, past every powerful, polished, perfectly eligible woman in that entire room, all the way to the very back, to the service doors, to where the help was standing, and she reached up and took hold of the rough, bleach-scented hand of a night shift cleaning woman, the one person in that whole gleaming room that not a single important soul had so much as glanced at all night long. And 400 of the most powerful people in the region slowly turned to stare at her. And what that woman did in the 30 seconds after that was the one thing nobody in that ballroom saw coming, least of all the little girl's father. If you've ever been the person standing in the back corner of the room that nobody important ever bothered to see, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that they're still seen. And subscribe today, because this channel was built for the very people the world looks straight past. The woman in the corner of that room was named Cora Hale. She was 27 years old, and to understand why a little child would cross an entire glittering room just to find her hand, one would have to go back many months before that fateful night, back to the ordinary mornings and the long, dragging nights of a mother who had nothing in this world except her sheer resiliences and a little daughter. Cora wasn't the kind of woman who made people turn their heads. She was thin, a little tall, with chestnut brown hair that was always tied back in a hurry with a stretched-out elastic band, and her gray eyes carried the weary look of someone who had grown far too used to counting every last coin before going to sleep. Her hands told the most about her life: calloused fingers, dry skin cracked by chemicals, and nails that always held a faint smell of cleaning solution that never quite washed away, no matter how many times she scrubbed beneath the cold faucet in her cramped, rented apartment. There had once been a time when those hands held paintbrushes. Cora had been an art school student once. She had once believed she would live by color. She had once fallen asleep over unfinished drawings, dreaming that one day her name would sit beneath a framed painting hanging on the white wall of some gallery. Then she got pregnant at 20. The man she loved disappeared before her daughter was even born, and the drawings were packed away in a cardboard box, shoved beneath the bed, where they still lay silent to this day. She left school, she went to work, and she learned something no classroom had ever taught her: that dreams were luxuries meant only for people who didn't have to worry about whether their child would have medicine to breathe. On the morning of the day everything began to slide downhill. Cora stood in the small office behind the supermarket where she worked the day shift as a cashier, her hands clenched tightly together, listening as the manager told her, in the flat voice of someone who had already made up his mind, that he was very sorry, but she had missed too many shifts, that he understood her child was sick, but the store simply couldn't keep carrying that burden, that this was the last time. She had taken 3 days off the week before, because Posey, her 6-year-old daughter, had suffered an asthma attack in the middle of the night, and Cora couldn't leave her child alone in a hospital just to run back and swipe groceries for strangers. She didn't argue. She had never been someone who knew how to argue. She only nodded, took off her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the desk as though orderliness could somehow make up for something, then stepped out into the cold, early winter air of Pittsburgh with the feeling that someone had just pulled a rug out from under her feet. But she still had her second job, and that was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. Every night, when the whole city changed clothes and went to sleep, Cora put on her faded janitor's uniform and caught the last bus to Sterling Tower, a towering mass of steel and glass rising in the middle of the financial district, where people she would never meet made more money in an hour than she earned in an entire month. The night work suited her in the only way that mattered. It allowed her to be with Posey all day, to take her daughter to school, to sit beside her while she drew, to watch over her breathing. People hired her to clean, to make every trace of a workday disappear before the sun came up. But Cora had realized early on that her real job wasn't to make things vanish. Her real job was to see. She wiped down desks where people left behind half-finished cups of coffee, and family photographs turned face down against the glass. She picked up papers that had been crumpled into balls and missed the trash can, hastily written notes that had been thrown away, things people thought they had already cast out of their lives. And in the stillness of those empty hallways at midnight, she learned how to read a person through the very things they left behind, and how to decide, though no one had ever asked her to, what was trash and what was still worth keeping. She didn't know that this quiet habit, this ability to see what other people had abandoned, would one day lead her to a child the whole world had given up on. Posey was Cora's whole world. And if there was one single thing that could explain why that mother accepted bending her back every night through empty hallways instead of sleeping, it was that 6-year-old daughter with tangled hair and a gap-toothed smile. Posey had been born with weak lungs, and her asthma was an uninvited guest, one that could arrive at any moment, especially on cold nights when the rented apartment the two of them shared kept whistling with wind through the window cracks. The landlord couldn't be bothered to fix. The night that made everything more urgent than ever was a Tuesday night near the end of the month, when Cora had just come home from her shift close to 3 o'clock in the morning, her body still carrying the smell of cleaning chemicals, and heard that familiar wheezing breath coming from the small bed pressed against the wall. Posey had sat bolt upright, her shoulders pulling up with each breath, her lips turning pale, trying to gulp down each mouthful of air as though it were something she had to fight for. Cora ran to the drawer where she kept the inhaler, and her hand went still when she picked up something light, weightless, empty. The medicine had run out the day before, and she had meant to buy more on payday, the payday that now would never come because she had just lost her day job. She searched her pockets, her purse, even the tin box where she saved loose change, and no matter how many times she counted, it still wasn't enough for a new inhaler plus bus fare to the all-night pharmacy on the other side of the city. That feeling of helplessness that night, that feeling of having to choose between two things no mother should ever have to choose between, burned itself into Cora like a scar. In the end, she scooped her daughter into her arms, wrapped her in a thin blanket, knocked on the elderly neighbor's door to borrow a few dollars, and sat through the long bus ride to the emergency room, with her child's face pressed against her chest, counting each breath as though she were counting falling drops of water. Posey was out of danger before dawn, but Cora never forgot it. She promised herself that even if she had to kneel down and scrub floors for the rest of her life, she would never let her child go without medicine again, and that was why she clung to the night shift at Sterling Tower like a drowning person clinging to a plank of wood. It was during the nights after she returned to work following that ordeal that something strange happened. Cora was cleaning the 41st floor, a floor reserved for luxurious conference rooms she had never been allowed to enter during the day, when she saw it lying beneath a leather chair, half hidden in the darkness, a dark brown leather wallet, thick and heavy, the kind of soft, genuine leather that told its worth the moment you touched it. She picked it up, and when she opened it to look for the owner's identity, her breath caught. Inside was a stack of cash, thicker than all the money she had ever held in her hands in her entire life. $100 bills arranged neatly, so many that she didn't dare count them. For a moment, just one very brief moment, Cora stood there in the dark room, her hand trembling, and thought of the empty inhaler, of rent already 2 months overdue, of Posey's pale face that night. This money could buy the two of them an entire winter of peace. No one would know. The camera on this floor had been broken for a long time, and she knew that well because she was the one who wiped the dust around it every week. But then she turned to the identification card tucked behind the clear plastic and read a name, Gio Ferrante, along with an embossed business card bearing the name of a transportation company she had never heard of. Cora stood motionless for a long while. Then she closed the wallet, wiped away the tears that had just reached the corners of her eyes, and carried it straight down to the security desk in the lobby, handed it directly to the night guard, wrote clearly where she had found it, signed her name in the logbook, then quietly returned to her cart and the hallways, waiting to be cleaned, never knowing that the name Gio Ferrante belonged to the most trusted right hand of the most powerful man on the East Coast, and that tonight, for the first time, Desmond Vale's world had gently brushed against her life. A few nights after the matter of the wallet, Cora's work schedule was changed, and for the first time, she was assigned to clean the top floor of Sterling Tower, the floor the janitors still whispered about as the forbidden floor, where none of them were allowed to go unless ordered, where the elevator required a special card and a code granted to only a few people. She didn't understand why she had been chosen. She only knew that the shift supervisor pressed that card into her hand with a look that was half instruction and half warning, telling her to do her job, not to look around too much, not to touch anything on the desks, and most of all, never to tell anyone what she saw up there. Cora nodded, and that night she stepped out of the elevator into a world she had never been able to imagine. The entire penthouse floor opened before her like a museum. The cold stone floor polished so smooth it reflected the city lights. The walls hung with real paintings that she, with the eyes of someone who had once studied art, recognized at once as priceless, and one enormous glass wall stretching all the way from floor to ceiling, holding all of Pittsburgh glittering below like a sea of fallen stars. Later, through scattered fragments of conversation, she would come to understand that the man who owned this place didn't only work here, but lived here with his little daughter, that he had turned the whole top floor into a home, because to him, it was the safest place on earth, a fortress in the sky no enemy could reach, the only place where he could close his eyes and sleep without worrying about the dangerous world he had walked into. But that first night, Cora knew none of it. She only pushed her cart quietly along the hallway, wiped down tabletops, set chairs back into place, and when she rounded the corner leading into the large living room where the glass wall glowed, she stopped. There was a tiny figure sitting there, right beside the glass, both knees drawn up against her chest, soft black hair falling down to cover half her face, her wide eyes staring out at the night city as though she were waiting for something she herself knew would never come. A little girl, about 5 years old, wearing pajamas printed with stars, sitting alone in the middle of that vast dark room, so small she almost seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Cora stood still. Normally, she should have called someone, should have gone to find an adult, should have reported it to security. But there was something in the way the child sat that made her unable to break it. It wasn't fear. It was a heavy stillness, a loneliness far too large for a body that small, the kind of silence Cora had once found somewhere inside herself on her worst nights. The child didn't cry. She only sat there, quiet and strangely awake, her eyes reflecting the distant lights of a city that didn't even know she existed. Cora didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was still awake, didn't ask where her mother was, where her father was, why she wasn't in bed. She had been a mother long enough to know that sometimes questions only made a child fold deeper into herself. Instead, she quietly opened the small bag she always carried, the one where she kept the butter cookies that were supposed to be her own late-night meal, took one out, and placed it gently on the glass ledge beside the child, not close enough to startle her, just close enough for her to know the cookie was meant for her. Then Cora said, in the softest and calmest voice she had, the very voice she used with Posey every night, "Good night, little princess." She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't look to see whether the child reacted. She only took up her cleaning cloth and returned to her work, wiping the glass surfaces, arranging the chairs, leaving the child in the quiet space that belonged to her alone, and only when Cora had nearly finished cleaning the room and glanced back did she see that the butter cookie on the ledge was no longer there. Cora learned the little girl's story the same way janitors always seem to learn everything, piece by piece, stitched together from whispers in break rooms, and half-finished remarks passed from one person to another. The person who told her the most was Margot Reese, a German woman well into her 60s, the family's nanny and housekeeper, an elderly woman with a straight back, silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, and a face so stern that people often mistook her for cold at first glance. But Cora, who had become skilled at reading people through the smallest details, had quickly realized that beneath that severe exterior was a heart worn thin by worry. One night, while Cora was cleaning the kitchen, Margot came in to make tea. And perhaps because she had grown too tired of keeping everything locked away for 2 long years, or perhaps because the quiet hours of the night made people more willing to open their hearts, the older woman began to talk. The child's name was Abilene, Margot said, and she hadn't always been silent like this. There had once been a time, the elderly woman recalled, her voice softening, when the little girl had been the most talkative child imaginable, a child who sang all day long, who asked endless questions about everything in the world, who laughed so brightly that the entire floor of the penthouse seemed to come alive with her joy. Her mother had been a gentle woman, a painter, the one who had hung all those paintings on the walls, and mother and daughter had rarely been apart. Then her mother became ill. It was a terrible illness, Margot said, without naming it, the kind that slowly consumed a person over many months, bringing with it endless hospital stays, endless visits where Abilene would sit beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, as it grew thinner and weaker with each passing day, until one autumn morning 2 years earlier, someone gently told the child that her mother was gone, that she wasn't hurting anymore, that she had become a star in the sky. And from that moment on, Abilene stopped speaking, not all at once, but gradually. She became quieter and quieter, spoke less and less, like a candle being slowly turned down until its flame disappeared completely. The doctors gave it a name, Margot explained, a name that sounded very scientific, selective mutism caused by trauma, but that name didn't truly explain anything about a 5-year-old girl who could sit for hours by a window waiting for someone who would never return. Her father, Margot said with a sigh, had done everything money could do. He hired the finest doctors, the most expensive child psychologists, took the girl from one clinic to another, from one therapy center to the next, invited specialists into the home carrying therapeutic games and carefully practiced smiles, but not one of them could reach her. The harder people tried to pull her out of her silence, the deeper she seemed to sink into it, because every adult who approached her carried the same anxious urgency, the same pleading look that silently begged, "Please talk, please be okay, you're frightening all of us." And a child could feel that all the way down to her bones, could feel that she had become a problem every adult around her was desperately trying to solve. Cora listened to everything quietly, her hands never stopping their work as she cleaned. When Margot finished, Cora didn't say much. She simply nodded softly, but inside, she understood something that perhaps all those expensive experts had never truly understood. The child didn't need another adult trying to fix her. She had already had more than enough of those. What she lacked, perhaps, was someone willing to let her be, someone who could look at her without demanding that she recover, that she speak, that she become who she used to be. And Cora, the night shift cleaning woman who had nothing to lose and needed nothing from the child, quietly decided that she would never become one more person trying to heal Abilene. She would simply treat her like a child, because that was exactly what she still was, a little girl carrying something far too heavy upon her small shoulders. Abilene's father was a name spoken in a lowered voice in one half of Pittsburgh, and not dared to be spoken at all in the other half. Desmond Vale was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the coldness of a man who had lived through more lifetimes than that. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture straight and motionless like a wall, his black hair marked by 2 streaks of silver at the temples, though he wasn't yet old, and his eyes were the thing people remembered forever, a cold blue-gray like the surface of steel on a winter morning. The kind of gaze that could make an entire noisy room fall suddenly silent without him having to say a single word. He rarely spoke, and when he did, people listened, not because his words were ornate, but because everyone understood that every word leaving this man's mouth had been carefully weighed and carried the weight of something that couldn't be taken back. On his left cheek was a faint scar, a pale white line running along his jawbone, the trace of a past he never spoke of. And whenever someone was reckless enough to ask about it, he would only look at them in silence until the question dissolved on its own into the air. He always wore custom-made suits in ash gray, perfectly cut, expensive but restrained, never showy. Just like the man himself, a force that preferred to remain hidden in the dark, rather than stand beneath the lights. And on his wrist, strangely out of place, among all that luxury, was an old, worn watch, its glass face scratched, its leather strap faded, a cheap watch anyone could have bought, the one thing he had never once taken off. It was his father's watch, the only thing left from the man who had led him into the world he was now desperately trying to escape. People said Desmond Vale controlled most of what moved through the ports and transport routes of the entire Northeast, that behind the polished disguise of a real estate and logistics magnate was a deeper, darker kind of power, a network he had inherited from his father, just as his father had inherited it from his grandfather. A legacy of blood and loyalty and unwritten laws no one was ever allowed to break. He had grown up in that world, had been raised by that world, and had once believed he had been born to rule it. But that belonged to the Desmond Vale of before, the man he had been before Abilene, before his wife fell ill, before he had to stand there and watch the only woman who had ever softened his iron heart wither away day by day in a hospital bed, while all the money and power he possessed in this world still couldn't save her. His wife's death did what no enemy had ever been able to do. It shattered something inside him, and when he knelt down and held his little daughter, who had stopped speaking, he realized with a cold horror that the world he had once been proud to reign over was the very world that had stolen from his daughter an ordinary childhood, a mother, and a home where no one had to watch the darkness beyond the door. From then on, Desmond Vale lived for only one thing, Abilene, and for a silent longing that burned so fiercely he hadn't dared speak of it to anyone. Not even to Gio Ferrante, the man he trusted most. He wanted out. He wanted to untangle himself from the web that had bound his family for 3 generations. He wanted to build his daughter a clean and safe life, a life where she would never have to know the things her father had done. He knew it was almost impossible. He knew men didn't walk away from that world without paying a terrible price. But every night, when he stood silently beside the glass wall looking down at the city and thought of his mute little daughter sleeping in the room behind him, he knew that was a price he was willing to pay. A young widower, rich beyond easy imagination, holding an entire empire in his hands and carrying around him a dangerously mesmerizing air, turned out to be one of the most fiercely hunted prizes anyone could imagine, and Abilene, though she was only a silent child of 5, witnessed all of it more clearly than anyone else. Ever since her mother died, women had begun appearing around her father, one after another. Beautiful women, sharp women, lavishly dressed women, each of them carrying some reason to be there, a party, a business deal, an invitation. But Abilene, with her quiet eyes that missed nothing, had soon understood that all of them had come for the very same thing. At the front of them was a woman named Thea Lindqvist, a powerful businesswoman with gleaming blonde hair always swept up into a perfect twist and a smile that never reached her eyes. Thea was the cleverest among them, and that was exactly why she was the most dangerous, because she understood that the shortest path to Desmond Vale's heart was to circle through his little daughter. Whenever Thea came, and she came very often, she would kneel right down in front of Abilene in a voice sweet as honey, calling the child an angel, a princess, stroking her hair, pressing expensive gifts into her hands wrapped in glittering cellophane, dolls, boxes of paints, things she imagined a child would like. And Desmond, standing there watching, sometimes almost allowed himself to believe that this woman truly cared for his daughter. But Abilene knew. The child always knew, because she had seen the moments grown-ups thought no one noticed, the moment Desmond turned his back to answer a phone call or greet another guest, and the smile on Thea's face would go out like a lamp with its power cut, her eyes passing over the child coldly, emptily, sometimes even flashing with a trace of irritation when Abilene touched her expensive dress. The gifts were forgotten the instant her father was no longer looking. The tenderness vanished at the same time as the smile. Children are the most perfect lie detectors nature ever created, and Abilene, with an entire silent world in which to watch and listen and remember, had read every one of them through and through. She knew who was sincere and who was only performing, and she hated that falseness with everything a 5-year-old heart could hate. And Desmond, no matter how cold and guarded he was, could still feel the rejection in the way his daughter's body stiffened whenever those women came near. Perhaps that was why, and perhaps also to end the endless siege that was wearing him down. One evening, in front of a room full of important people, when one guest grew too bold and lightly asked whether he had any intention of marrying again, Desmond Vale set down his glass, looked straight at that person, and said in the deep, calm voice the whole room could hear that he would only marry the woman his daughter chose for herself, no one else. The entire room fell still for a moment, then rose into murmurs of admiration. People praised him as a wonderful father, a faithful husband. But all of them, every single one, silently understood the truth behind that vow. The only daughter who had the right to choose had not spoken a word in 2 years, had not chosen anyone, had not grown close to anyone. That vow was a refusal dressed in noble clothing, a locked door with its key thrown to the bottom of the sea, a way of saying no that no one could condemn, because the only person in the world who could turn that lock had sunk into silence long ago, and seemed unlikely to ever turn it for anyone. Through the nights that followed, Abilene still sat there beside the glass wall whenever Cora came to clean, and Cora kept the same quiet habit of her own, a cookie placed on the ledge, a soft goodnight, little princess spoken into the air. Then she would turn back to her work, asking nothing, pressing nothing, never once questioning the child about anything. And little by little, though no one said it aloud, something began to take shape between them, fragile and slow as settling mist. One night, while cleaning the storage room behind the kitchen, a room filled with old things people had put away and then forgotten, Cora found it lying in a dust-covered cardboard box, an old wooden music box, its lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl that had begun to peel, its paint flaking off in patches. She picked it up, wiped away the dust, and tried turning the winding knob, but the box only made a dry clicking sound before falling silent again. The mechanism inside long since broken. She should have put it back in the box, but there was something about that poor little music box that made her hesitate, perhaps because it was like the things she picked up every night, the things people thought had lost their value, things they believed were worth throwing away, when in truth all they needed was a little care to come back to life. Cora took it home to her apartment, and in the few spare hours between her 2 shifts, she sat at the chipped kitchen table beneath the dim yellow light, patiently removing each tiny screw, cleaning away the rust, adjusting the loosened spring, doing that delicate work with the same calloused hands that had once held paintbrushes. And those hands, it turned out, still remembered how to bring beautiful things back to life. When the final spring was fitted back into place, and she wound it up, the box trembled for a moment, then released a melody, an old lullaby, clear and sorrowful, the notes falling one by one like drops of moonlight. The next night, Cora brought the music box up to the penthouse floor. She didn't hand it directly to Abilene, didn't say this is a gift for you, didn't do anything to turn it into an event. She simply placed the box on the low table near the glass wall where the child always sat, wound it so it would play for a while, then quietly turned away and continued mopping the floor in the far corner of the room, as though the music box had only happened to be there by chance, as though she wasn't paying attention to whether the child reacted or not. And for the first time in 2 years, something inside Abilene stirred. The little girl, who always sat facing the window, slowly turned her head. Her eyes followed the music box, and when the melody rose into the room, Cora, though she was pretending to be absorbed in mopping the floor, still managed to see the child move closer, a little, then a little more, until she was sitting right beside the table, bowing her head to listen, her small shoulders loosening from the curled defensive posture she had always kept. Cora said nothing. She left the child alone with the music, and when the melody slowly ran out and went quiet, she stepped over in silence, wound it once more, then moved away again. And that was when it happened, that first moment. Abilene lifted her eyes and looked at her. It wasn't the empty, indifferent look the child gave the rest of the world, but a direct look, a look with someone inside it, a silent question living in those dark brown eyes. You made it sing again. You're really leaving it here for me. And Cora, answering a wordless question with a wordless answer of her own, only gave a small nod, calm and gentle, as if to say, yes, it's yours. You can listen as long as you like. Abilene looked at her for another moment, then lowered her gaze and placed her tiny hand on the lid of the music box, gently, as if touching a living creature. And the child nodded back, a small and solemn nod. And so, in that dark and silent room suspended high above the city, without a single word being spoken, the cleaning woman and the mute child truly spoke to each other for the first time. After the night of the music box, something changed, and the nights that followed were no longer the same as before. Abilene began waiting for Cora. The child didn't say that, of course, but Cora noticed it through the small signs only a mother could read, through the way the little girl was already sitting beside the glass wall whenever the elevator doors opened, through the way her eyes brightened for one very quick moment before growing quiet again, through the way she nudged the music box toward the middle of the table like a silent invitation. And then one night, the child did something that made Cora freeze in the middle of the room. While Cora was bending down to wipe the low table, Abilene quietly came closer, and with her tiny fingers, she slipped something into the pocket of Cora's uniform, quick and clumsy as a baby bird, then hurriedly stepped back and turned her face away as though nothing had happened. Cora reached into her pocket and took out a piece of candy, a fruit candy wrapped in red cellophane, a little sticky, perhaps because the child had been holding it in her palm for quite a while. Cora's throat tightened. She understood at once what it meant, because through all those nights she had been the one giving, the one placing cookies on the ledge, the one bringing the music box, and now, for the first time, that child was giving something back, offering something of her own. And to a child, a piece of candy held in the hand isn't just a piece of candy, it's an entire heart. Cora didn't make a fuss, didn't gather the child into her arms, didn't cry out the way any other adult might have done. She only unwrapped the candy, put it in her mouth, nodded as though it were the finest candy she had ever tasted, and said softly, "It's delicious. Thank you, sweetheart." And Abilene, still looking away, let the corner of her mouth lift just slightly, and Cora saw it clearly. A tiny smile, the first smile. From then on, a private language began to bloom between them, a language that didn't need speech. On cold winter nights, when the warmth inside the room met the cold glass and left a hazy layer of mist across the surface, Cora playfully lifted a finger and drew a little sun in the fog, then turned to look at the child. Abilene hesitated for a moment, then crept closer, raised her tiny finger to the cloudy glass, and drew a star beside Cora's sun. Cora drew a house. Abilene drew a cat. Cora drew a heart, and after a very long pause, Abilene drew beside that heart two small figures, one big and one little, standing hand in hand. And so, night after night, the two of them spoke through the mist on the glass, telling each other wordless stories. And every morning, when the fog faded, those drawings disappeared, but what had formed between them remained. Margot was the one who discovered it. One night, the old woman woke and went looking for Abilene, and through the crack of the door, she found that scene, the silent child sitting beside the cleaning woman, the two of them leaning together over the misted glass. And on the child's face was something Margot hadn't seen in 2 years: peace. The old woman stood motionless at the threshold, one hand lifted to cover her mouth, and her aged eyes filled with tears. She had watched so many expensive specialists come and go, so many therapies fail, so many nights when the child sat in silence staring out the window, and yet the person who had done what all of them couldn't do was a night shift cleaning woman who asked for nothing, forced nothing, and simply showed up. The next morning, Margot should have reported it. According to every rule, she should have stopped it, should have separated the child from a stranger, but she didn't. She chose silence. She chose to let that door remain quietly open, because for the first time after 2 long, endless years, she had seen light return to the eyes of the child she loved like her own granddaughter, and she didn't have the heart. She simply couldn't have the heart to put it out. Margot managed to keep the secret for about 2 weeks, but the conscience of a loyal housekeeper finally wouldn't allow her to keep hiding something so important from the employer she had served for so many years. One morning, while Desmond was sitting at his desk drinking coffee, Margot came to his side, and in her careful, even voice, she told him everything: about the night shift cleaning woman, about the music box, about the drawings on the misted glass, and about the most important thing of all, that Abilene had begun smiling again, had begun waiting for someone, had begun showing responses that no doctor over the past 2 years had been able to awaken. Desmond set his coffee cup down. He said nothing for a long while, but Margot, who understood him better than anyone, noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the surface of the desk, the signs of a man being torn between 2 opposing instincts. The first instinct, the instinct of the man he had become after so many years living in the dark, shouted that this was a threat, that no one got close to his daughter without a motive, that a poor woman suddenly becoming close to the heiress of one of the richest men on the East Coast was surely planning something. But the second instinct, the instinct of a father who had been desperate for far too long, whispered a different question. What if this woman had truly done what the whole world couldn't? Desmond called Gio Ferrante in that very afternoon. He ordered him to investigate the woman, to dig down to the roots, to turn over every stone in her life, to find out who she truly was and what she wanted. Gio, the quiet and meticulous man who had long been Desmond's most trusted right hand, went to work with his familiar cold precision. But only a few days later, when Gio returned with the file in his hand, his usually calm face carried a look that was hard to read. The woman named Cora Hale, Gio reported, 27 years old, a single mother, 1 6-year-old daughter with asthma, recently lost her day job, 2 months behind on rent, not a stain on her record, not one suspicious connection, nothing beyond a life so poor and difficult it was almost painful to look at. Then Gio paused and placed something on the desk that seemed to trouble even him. "This woman," he said, "is the one who returned my wallet." Desmond looked up. Gio told him about the night he had dropped his wallet on the 41st floor, the wallet thick with cash that he had assumed he would never see again, and yet by morning it had been returned intact down to the last dollar, along with a note and a careful signature in the guard's logbook, signed Cora Hale. A woman behind on rent, a woman who didn't have enough money to buy medicine for her child, had held in her hands a stack of cash large enough to change her entire winter, and had returned it without a penny missing. The room fell into silence. Desmond Vale had spent his whole life among people who all wanted something, had grown used to every kindness having a price, every smile hiding a calculation, and now before him was proof of a person who seemed not to fit any rule he had ever known. He didn't rush to trust her. Men like him didn't survive by trusting quickly, but he also didn't order her dismissed, didn't sever the strange bond beginning to grow between that woman and his daughter. Instead, he chose a path in between. He allowed Cora to continue, but under quiet observation, and more importantly, he began watching her himself. In the nights that followed, from the darkness of the distant hallway or through the camera feed in his office, Desmond Vale silently watched that cleaning woman, watched her place cookies on the ledge, watched her wind the music box, watched his daughter move closer to her little by little, and watched the drawings the two of them made together on the fogged glass. He didn't step out. He didn't say a word. Their two worlds, the world of the most powerful man on the East Coast and the world of a woman who had nothing but her calloused hands, still hadn't truly touched. But the man standing in the dark, for the first time in a very long while, felt something stir faintly inside his chest, a feeling he had thought he had lost long ago, curiosity and something even more fragile, a small thread of hope. That winter, Desmond Vale decided to do something he had been carrying in his heart for a long time, something that carried the meaning of closure. He organized a grand gala to announce the creation of a charitable foundation named after his late wife, a foundation for children who had lost their parents, a way to turn his private grief into something decent and lasting. And also, though he didn't say it aloud, a way to draw a firm line against the past, to send a message to everyone still circling him that his heart already belonged to someone, belonged to a woman who was no longer there, and that the siege of marriage proposals could finally come to an end. The gala was held in the ground-floor atrium of Sterling Tower, a magnificent space where crystal chandeliers hung down like waterfalls of ice, with 400 guests counted among the most powerful, the wealthiest, and as whispers had long suggested, the most dangerous people in the entire region. That night, the building's cleaning crew was also called in, but only to work behind the scenes, quietly cleaning in the background, gathering glasses and cups, wiping up spilled wine, standing tucked into shadowed corners near the service doors, and waiting to be summoned. Cora was among them. She didn't want to be there at all. A room full of rich people was the last place on earth she wanted to step into, but she had been assigned, and she had no right to refuse. She put on the cleanest version of her uniform that she owned, stood silently at the far end of the room, beside a cart piled with towels and dirty glasses, trying to make herself as small as possible, counting the minutes in her mind until this long night ended and she could go home to Posey. She didn't know that on the other side of that glittering room, the child she had been speaking to through drawings on the glass for so many nights was there as well. Margot had brought Abilene down to the gala, dressed her in a deep blue velvet dress, fastened a bow in her hair, and led her to stand beside her father at the center of the room, because this was a gala honoring the memory of the child's mother, and her presence was something no one could do without. But for Abilene, standing there among a forest of glittering strangers was a torment. She was surrounded by exactly the faces she feared most, women in splendid evening gowns competing to sweep toward her, one praising how pretty her dress was, another bending down to say how quickly she had grown, each of them glancing with half an eye toward Desmond to see whether he was watching, every smile a carefully staged performance. And at the front of them, as always, was Thea Lindquist, more radiant than ever that night in a wine-colored gown, the woman who had claimed the place right beside Desmond and didn't leave it for even half a step, her hand occasionally resting lightly on his arm, with the practiced intimacy of someone who wanted the whole room to believe there was already something between them. Abilene stood there, her small hand gripping the hem of her dress, her eyes moving around the room full of loud voices and false faces, and she felt that familiar suffocation rising inside her chest, that feeling of being lost, that feeling of being looked at like a decoration without anyone truly seeing her. Her father stood right beside her, but he was busy greeting important guests, nodding, shaking hands, playing the role of the perfect host. Margot stood a few steps away, watching the child with anxious eyes, and on the small stage at the front, the microphone had already been prepared for Desmond's speech, the moment when he would officially announce the foundation and close a chapter of his life. Not one person among those 400 people, not Desmond, not Margot, not even Cora standing quietly in the farthest corner of the room, could have imagined that in only a few minutes, that silent child was about to do something that would make the entire room hold its breath. That moment came from something very small, the way great collapses always seem to begin with something very small. Thea Lindquist, perhaps wanting to score a point in front of Desmond standing right beside her, suddenly bent down to Abeline's level, gave the child her brightest smile, and in a voice as sweet as it was faintly condescending, told her to say hello. Come now, say hello to me, princess. Even one little sentence will do. The group of women around them laughed softly, eyes turning toward the child, waiting, and Desmond also looked back at his daughter with a fleeting tension passing across his face. To Abeline, that pressure, all those adult eyes fixed on her at once, all those smiles waiting for her to perform, was more than she could bear. The child went rigid, her shoulders drawing up, her hand gripping the hem of her dress until her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak. Of course she didn't speak. But this time, instead of merely folding into silence the way she always had before, something inside her reached its limit. Abeline stepped back once, then again, slipped out of the circle of glittering gowns, and began to walk. At first, no one noticed, but the child kept walking, alone, crossing the vast room, her little shoes tapping out steady footsteps across the polished marble floor, passing through the crowd of powerful people deep in conversation, passing the ladies, passing the gentlemen, passing even her father without looking back, straight toward the far end of the room. And gradually, one by one, the whole atrium realized something unusual was happening. The conversation sank into murmurs, then died away completely, and 400 pairs of eyes turned to follow the small figure in the blue velvet dress walking toward the service doors. Cora, tucked into the corner beside her cart, looked up too when the entire room suddenly went quiet, and when she realized who was walking toward her, her heart tightened in her chest. Abeline walked straight to her, stopped right in front of her, lifted her small face to look at Cora with those dark brown eyes, and reached out her tiny hand to take Cora's calloused one, holding it tightly as though it were the only anchor in the world. Then, in the absolute stillness of a room holding its breath, the child who had been silent for 2 whole years opened her mouth, and in a small voice, slightly hoarse from long disuse, but clear enough to carry to the farthest corners of the atrium, she softly spoke. "You're here, the one who truly sees me." Those 7 words fell into the room like pebbles dropping onto a still lake. Cora sank to her knees, tears spilling over beyond her control, both hands enclosing the child's small hand, because she understood better than anyone the cost of those 7 words. She understood that she had just heard 2 years of silence break open in a room full of terrifying strangers. Break open because of her, because of a cleaning woman who had repaired an old music box, and had never once asked the child for anything. And on the other side of the room, Desmond Vale stood frozen, his face, usually cold as steel, now white and stunned, his widened eyes fixed on the daughter whose voice he hadn't heard in 2 long years. Then, at that fragile moment, some man's voice rang out from near the stage, a voice perhaps well meant, but accidentally cruel, loud enough for the whole room to hear. So Miss Vale has finally chosen someone after all, and the entire room, like one single body, slowly turned. 400 of the most powerful people in the region, all directing their gaze toward the cleaning woman in the faded uniform kneeling in the corner, hand in hand with the little daughter of the boss. For one brief moment, Cora understood exactly what was happening. She knew about the vow. Who in this building hadn't heard whispers about the owner's vow? And she knew what that sentence, just carelessly spoken aloud, meant in the minds of the 400 people now looking at her. The only daughter with the right to choose had chosen, and she had chosen Cora. She felt the weight of all those eyes pressing down on her. She felt the glittering moment being woven around her by the entire room, the fairy tale of the cleaning woman suddenly chosen by fate. And she knew that any other woman in her position might have smiled, might have stood up, might have let that current carry her toward the beautiful ending everyone was waiting for. But Cora wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the child holding her hand. She released the little girl's hand, very gently, then knelt fully so she was level with the child's eyes, turning her back on all 400 people watching, until there was no one left between her and Abeline except the 2 of them, just as it had been on those nights beside the glass wall. And she said, softly, only loud enough for the child to hear, "My princess, what you just did is the bravest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. Thank you for telling everyone that we're friends, Because that's exactly what we are. You and I are friends, and we'll always be friends, no matter what happens. Abilene looked at her, and for the first time that evening, the child's small face softened, her shoulders no longer drawn up tight with tension. Then Cora stood. She turned to face the entire room, facing the curious eyes, the half-smiles, the measuring looks, and she found Desmond Vale among the crowd, the most powerful man on the East Coast, standing motionless as he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Cora took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. But it was clear enough, loud enough to carry across the atrium, because this entire room was exactly where the words she was about to say needed to be heard. Mr. Vale, she said, your daughter is the most wonderful child I've ever known, and what she did tonight was sacred. But I need to say this very clearly, right here, so everyone in this room can hear it. I'm not a prize for anyone to win, and she isn't a key to open any door. Tonight, your daughter didn't choose a wife for you. She only chose a friend for herself, someone willing to see her when no one else would, and that's all she did. That is something innocent and beautiful, and I won't stand here and let it be twisted into something else, not right in front of her. The entire room fell utterly silent. Not a laugh, not a whisper, only the silence of 400 people who had just been taught, by a cleaning woman in a faded uniform, a lesson their money had never been able to buy. Cora looked down at Abilene one last time and smiled at her, a gentle smile full of love, then said softly, friends don't need a reason, little one, and they don't need any reward either. I'll come up again tomorrow night, and we'll listen to the music box together. And then, under the stunned eyes of 400 of the most powerful people in the region, under the eyes of the child's father himself, Cora turned, set both hands on the cart piled with towels and dirty glasses, and quietly pushed it through the service door, out of the magnificent atrium, leaving everything behind her, the crystal lights, the wealthy people, the vow, the fairy tale everyone had been waiting for her to step into, and she went straight home to her own little girl, because to Cora, what that child had just done was far too sacred to be turned into entertainment for a room full of strangers. The next morning, Cora handed in her resignation. She couldn't go back to Sterling Tower anymore, couldn't bear the thought of walking through that atrium every night beneath the eyes that now knew her face, couldn't bear the whispers that were surely spreading through the building about the cleaning woman Miss Vale had chosen. She knew people would talk, knew they would embroider the truth, knew some would call her an opportunist, some would call her foolish, and she didn't want to be tied to any of it. She only wanted peace, wanted to return to her small life, to Posey, to the things she could still control on her own. But that small life was falling apart too. The 2 months of unpaid rent finally caught up with her, and with both her day job and night job gone, Cora had no choice but to move. She packed her and Posey's whole life into a few cardboard boxes, including the old cardboard box that held the unfinished paintings from her student days, the one she had kept under the bed for so many years, then moved to an even smaller, cheaper rented room in an even more rundown neighborhood on the other side of the city, a place that didn't appear in any paperwork, a place no one knew about. She disappeared, quietly and completely, the way poor people had always been able to disappear from the world of the rich, without leaving a trace. Meanwhile, on the highest floor of Sterling Tower, Desmond Vale couldn't sleep. The night after the gala, he stood beside the glass wall where his daughter always sat, looking down at the glittering city, and the woman's words kept echoing again and again inside his head. I'm not a prize for anyone to win. The child isn't a key to open any door. He had lived his whole life among people who always wanted to take something from him. Money, power, protection, a position. And he had grown so used to it that he had come to see it as human nature, that everyone had a price, that every smile hid a calculation. And yet that woman, the one who had the most understandable reason in the world to seize the golden chance that had fallen at her feet, a poor mother drowning in debt, was the only one who had turned her back and walked away. She hadn't only refused him, she had refused on behalf of his daughter too, had stepped forward to protect that fragile moment from being stained by the crowd, had done what he himself, the father, should have done but had stood frozen and failed to do. And Abilene had spoken. After 2 years, after all those doctors and specialists and long silent nights, his daughter had found her voice again. Not because of him, not because of anything his money could buy, but because a night shift cleaning woman had repaired an old music box for her. Desmond realized, with cold and piercing clarity, that he couldn't let that woman vanish from his daughter's life. And deeper than that was a truth he didn't yet dare to name, that he didn't want her to vanish from his own life either. The next morning, he summoned Gio. And this time the order wasn't to investigate, but to find her. But his men came back empty-handed. The address in the personnel file was no longer correct. Someone else had already moved into the old rented room, and the landlord only knew that she had left without saying where she was going. The woman whom the whole city of Pittsburgh would have thought was already in Desmond Vale's palm, the man who could find anyone, buy anything, had just dissolved into the very world of invisible people he had never once needed to care about. And for the first time in his life, that powerful boss understood the helplessness of a man searching for someone who didn't want to be found. It took nearly 2 weeks, and only after Gio followed the smallest traces, medical records, patient lists, did they find her. But not in any rented room. They found her in a public hospital on the edge of the city, where Posey had just been rushed into emergency care after a severe asthma attack in the middle of the night. The worst one she had ever had, perhaps because the new rented room was damp and full of dust. Perhaps because over the past several days, her mother had simply been too exhausted to care for her as carefully as she should have. When Gio brought the news, Desmond didn't send someone. He went himself. He found Cora slumped on a hard plastic chair outside the pediatric ward, her face gray with sleeplessness and fear, her calloused hands clenched tightly together. And when she looked up and saw him standing there, the most powerful man on the East Coast in that shabby public hospital corridor, surprise flashed through her eyes for an instant, before turning at once into caution. Desmond didn't say much. He only sat down in the chair beside her, leaving a distance respectful enough between them, and quietly stayed there with her through the long hours of waiting, asking no questions, pressing nothing, in the very same way she had once stayed beside his daughter. Posey was out of danger close to dawn, and only then, when Cora went to the cashier's desk with her heart heavy because she knew she had no way to pay the bill this time, did they tell her that the entire hospital fee had already been paid. She didn't need to ask to know who had done it. She turned back to find Desmond, and this time there was no gratitude in her eyes, but a hard, steady spark. She told him she was grateful for his kindness, but she couldn't accept it, that she would pay back every dollar, no matter how long it took, because she didn't want her daughter growing up with the thought that her mother had traded something away to receive this help. Desmond looked at her for a long while, and then, instead of growing angry or insisting as she had expected, the corner of his mouth lifted into a tired smile, the first real smile she had ever seen on that cold face. He said, "You know, in the past 2 years, no one has ever returned anything to me. People only try to take more." And then, sitting beside each other in that empty hallway at daybreak, 2 people from 2 worlds separated by an entire abyss began to talk. Truly talk. For the first time. He told her about his wife, about the months he had stood watching the woman he loved wither away while all his money meant nothing, about the terrible loneliness of a man standing in the middle of everything and still having nothing in his hands. She told him about Posey, about the nights spent counting every breath her daughter took, about the dream of becoming a painter that had been packed away beneath a bed, about the feeling of being an invisible person the whole world looked straight through. They didn't mention the gala, didn't mention the vow, didn't mention the crowd that had turned to stare at her that night. They only spoke like 2 exhausted single parents, each carrying a child and a scarred heart. And when everything else was stripped away, the empire and the poverty, the power and the shame, that was exactly all they were. 2 human beings sitting side by side in the darkness before dawn, tired, wounded, and for the first time in a very long while, no longer alone. That meeting in the hospital changed something in Desmond, or more precisely, it lit up a decision he had been silently carrying for a long time, but had never had enough courage to carry out. He had seen in Cora something his entire world didn't have, a kind of purity that couldn't be bought, and he understood that if he wanted his daughter to grow up near a person like that, if he wanted Abilene to have a clean and free life, then first he had to free himself from the dark web that had bound his family for 3 generations. He couldn't want light for his child while continuing to stand in the shadows. And so Desmond Vale did the thing that people in his world considered unthinkable. He tried to get out. He began quietly transferring, dismantling, cutting one cord after another, moving all his operations into transparent and legal businesses, closing the doors his father had opened, refusing deals he once never would have refused. But no one walked out of that world without paying a price, and the price came looking for him in the form of men who had once called him brother. One night, in an empty warehouse near the docks, Desmond faced the people who represented the past he was trying to reject. Men who saw his decision as betrayal, as a threat to all of them. The conversation began with cold words and quickly rose into tension. Threats were spoken, the air grew thick, and there were moments when everything seemed about to slip beyond control. Moments of struggle, clenched fists, and footsteps closing in. Desmond stood there alone, surrounded by dangerous men, without flinching. His blue-gray eyes cold as steel, and fixed on the man in charge. And in the calm, deep voice that had once made even the most reckless men hesitate, he made it clear that his decision was final, that he was leaving, that he wasn't taking anything of theirs and wasn't threatening them, and that if anyone dared touch his family, his daughter, then that person would have to face everything he had left. In the end, perhaps because the authority he had built over so many years still carried enough weight, perhaps because they understood that a Desmond Vale with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than anyone, those men stepped back. They let him leave, but the price had become clear. He lost most of his influence, lost the connections that had fed his family's power, lost the position that made half the city hold its breath whenever his name was spoken. He walked out of that warehouse that night with far less power than he had carried in, a man who had willingly taken off his dark crown. But as he drove home beneath the night sky, past the empty streets, he didn't feel loss. For the first time in his life, he felt light. He felt as though he could breathe. He felt that the thing he had just traded everything to gain, a clean future for his daughter, was worth more than all the power he had ever held in his hands. And he knew that whether Cora chose him or not, whether the story between them went anywhere at all, becoming a father Abilene could be proud of was already reward enough for everything he had just given up. They came to each other slowly, more slowly than anything she had ever known. And that was exactly the only way any of it could become real. Cora didn't rush to trust, and Desmond didn't rush to press. In the first months, he was simply there, bringing Abilene to play with Posey on weekend afternoons, letting the two little girls sit drawing together on the floor, letting them giggle with each other in that private language children have, and he realized that beside lively little Posey, his daughter was speaking more each day, laughing more each day, coming back to life more each day. They did everything for the two children first, and for themselves afterward. Cora was firm about that, because she had sworn she would never let Abilene attach herself to something only to watch it break apart and shatter that small heart all over again. And it was in that very slowness that the two adults gradually understood that what was growing between them wasn't the fairy tale that Room had tried to weave that night, wasn't the story of a boss choosing a poor girl, but something far more ordinary and far more lasting. Two people who had been battered by life to the very end, slowly realizing they could sit beside each other in silence and feel at peace, could carry burdens together, could parent together two children who, in their own way, had already chosen each other before anyone else did. They never once mentioned the vow. That vow belonged to that glittering and false night, and it had no place in what had truly taken root between them through afternoons of drawing pictures and simple dinners. 1.5 years after the night at the hospital, they married. Not in a crystal atrium with 400 guests, but in a small garden on a warm, late spring afternoon, with only a small handful of people who truly loved them. Margot was there, wiping away tears through the entire ceremony. Gio stood there, and for the first time, someone saw him smile. And the two children were the stars of that day. Posey was the little flower girl, radiant in a lilac dress, holding a basket of petals too distracted by the crowd to remember to scatter them. As for Abilene, the little girl who had once fallen into years of silence, she chattered brightly all day long, because it turned out that once the dam had broken, she had a whole storehouse of words saved up over the years just waiting to pour out, and she hasn't stopped since. When the time came for the real vows, not the proud vow spoken in that atrium, but the gentle promise between two people, Abilene stepped forward, solemn as if she were carrying out the most sacred ritual of her life, and placed something on the small table in front of them. It was the old music box, the wooden box with peeling mother-of-pearl inlay that Cora had repaired in those first nights, the thing that had opened the door to everything that came after. The child wound it up, and in the garden filled with late afternoon sunlight, that old lullaby rose again, clear and tender, the notes falling like moonlight, and this time not one person there could hold back tears. Cora looked at the man standing beside her, looked at the two children holding hands, looked at the little music box that had once been a discarded thing covered in dust in a storage room, and she understood that sometimes the most beautiful things in this world are the very things people have been too quick to throw away, waiting only for someone to stop, pick them up, and believe they're still worth keeping. After the wedding, Cora didn't become an idle lady living in silk and luxury, though she could have done exactly that now if she had wanted to. Instead, she pulled out from beneath the bed the old cardboard box holding the unfinished paintings from her student days. And for the first time in 7 years, she picked up a paintbrush again. But she didn't paint for herself alone. She had an idea that had begun glowing quietly inside her from the night little Abilene placed her hand on the music box. An idea about all the other children out there carrying a grief far too large for their small bodies, children who had stopped speaking, who had folded into themselves, who had become invisible in a world too busy trying to fix them. Cora opened a free art class, meant especially for those children. Children who had lost a father, lost a mother, lost someone dearly loved. Children for whom words had become too difficult, but whose hands could still tell stories. She rented a bright room in a working-class neighborhood, set up low tables, filled the place with paper and paint and clay, and she never forced a single child to speak before they were ready. She simply sat down beside them, placed a blank sheet of paper and a box of colors in front of them, then let them draw the pain they couldn't name. Draw houses, draw stars, draw the faces of those who were gone, draw everything that had been caught inside their small chests. And in that room filled with color, one child after another, each in their own way and in their own rhythm, began to open again, just as Abilene once had. Some children took many months, some needed only a few weeks, but all of them found in the woman with hands smelling faintly of paint something they couldn't find anywhere else. An adult willing to sit quietly beside them without demanding, without pressing, without turning their grief into a problem that needed to be solved. Desmond stood behind her through all of it, and the charitable foundation named after his late wife, the foundation he had announced at that fateful gala, now found its true purpose. All the funding for Cora's class, then for the second class, the third class that opened in other parts of the city, came from that very foundation. The man who had once controlled the ports and dark shipping routes now poured all the resources he had left into one single thing, turning the shadowed legacy he had inherited into something that could heal. He didn't step forward to take credit. He didn't put his name on any sign. He simply stood quietly behind the scenes, signed the checks, rented the rooms, bought the boxes of colors, and sometimes, on certain afternoons, sat tucked into a corner of the classroom, watching his wife bend beside a strange child, watching that child's eyes slowly begin to brighten. Abilene and Posey grew up among all of it, 2 sisters, who often came to the classes to help, to lay out the paints, to sit and draw with the new children who arrived. And Abilene, the girl who had once been silent, turned out to be the best at making a frightened child feel safe, because she understood, more deeply than any adult could, what it felt like to be trapped inside silence, and she understood that sometimes what a child needs isn't words, but simply someone who sits down beside them, pushes over a box of colors, and quietly stays. That night, every one of the 400 people standing in that glittering atrium was certain they had just witnessed a fairy tale, the story of a lucky cleaning woman suddenly smiled upon by fate, chosen by a child, and handed an entire fortune in a single night. But that had never been the real story. The real story was far humbler than that, and far more beautiful too. The real story was about a child who had lived for 2 whole years in silence, because the whole world around her had been so desperate to fix her, and about the one person who simply saw her, the person who repaired an old music box, placed a cookie on a window ledge, drew a sun on a misted glass wall, and never once demanded that the child give anything back. Because a child's heart can never be deceived by a performance. Abilene didn't cross that room to reach the richest, the most beautiful, or the most powerful person there. She crossed through all of them to reach the only person who had truly seen her. Because over those 2 years, she had had more than enough time to watch and understand that not one of those glittering people had ever once looked at her as a human being, but only as a door, a key, a path leading to something else. And that is the lesson this story wants to leave behind, that the most precious thing one human being can give another isn't money, isn't gifts, isn't elegant promises, but simply the willingness to see them, to truly see them, and to love them without asking for anything in return. A wounded child doesn't need someone to fix them. They only need someone willing to sit beside them, patiently stay, and let them be themselves until they find their own way back. And sometimes, the poorest person in the room is the richest in the only thing that truly matters, the heart to see another human being. If tonight's story has touched something in your heart, if you believe, as we do, that the rarest and most beautiful thing in this world is to be seen and loved unconditionally by someone, then please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing this journey, so that each day, more meaningful stories can find their way to you and to the people who need to hear them. And now, I truly want to hear from you. In your life, who was the person who truly saw you, who saw your real self at the very moment when you felt most invisible to the whole world? And have you ever told them how much that meant to you? Leave your story in the comments below, because we read every single line, and nothing makes us happier than listening to the things that come from the deepest part of your hearts. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, peace, and love every single day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.